Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. The truth you probably would unlast a single day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight. As journey together, congratulations. You wake up, your breath curls into a little white ghost above your lips, vanishes into the thatched ceiling beams, where frost clings like quiet mold. Your back aches, stomach growls. The fire is down to a whisper, barely alive beneath a crust of ash. Outside, the world is ice. Frozen mud, naked trees, winds that slice through wool like knives through cabbage. There is no electricity, no central heating, no warm shower waiting for you. You're not wearing pajamas. You're wearing the same coarse wool you wore yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. It is the year 1325. You are a peasant, and it's winter. You don't know the word hypothermia, but you do know what happens to the old woman who lives at the edge of the village when her fire dies, or the child who sleeps too far from the hearth. Cold doesn't just nip at your nose. It kills, slow and silent, but somehow they survived. Not all of them, no, but many. Somehow, without fleece blankets, gas heaters, or down comforters, millions of people made it through winters far colder than ours. They did it with grit, with habit, strange superstitions, clever tricks, and a whole lot of body heat. Tonight, let's go back. Back to a time of biting winds and smoky cottages. The bone-cold reality of winter in the Middle Ages winter came early in those days, and it stayed far too long. From the early 1300s to the mid-1800s, much of Europe experienced what is now known as the Little Ice Age, a long period of cooler temperatures that turned already difficult winters into bitter, bone-cracking sieges. Snow wasn't just a seasonal guest, it was a slow-moving predator, one that buried roads, ruined crops, and chewed its way into every crack in every cottage. For peasants, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, there was no cozy option. No, let's turn up the thermostat. The homes they lived in were built more for survival than for comfort, and even that was being generous. Imagine a single room, maybe two, if you're lucky. The walls are made of wattle and daub, a sort of ancient, hand-patted plaster made from clay, straw, and animal dung. Okay. It cracks in the cold. Wind slides through the gaps. Okay. The roof is thatch, layers of dried straw, often crawling with bugs. Okay. Beneath your feet, hard earth, maybe packed dirt, okay. Maybe stone. Either way, it steals the heat from your body like a thief in the night. Inside this little hut live 6, sometimes 10 people. A family pressed together like stacked firewood. There's a fire pit in the center, but no chimney. Smoke fills the air, making your eyes water and your lungs ache. You get used to it. You have to. That fire is everything. It cooks your food. It dries your clothes. It chases away the death that waits outside. If it goes out during the night, it's a disaster. You can't relight it by morning. It could be the end. To keep the fire alive, embers are banked beneath ashes before sleep, a delicate trick that traps the heat and keeps it glowing. But it doesn't give off much warmth. Not really, just enough to make you hope. And still, the cold gets in. It creeps in through the walls, through the roof, through the spaces between the wooden boards. It seeps into your bones. You feel it in your fingers, in your knees, in your teeth. It curls around your feet like a cat that hates you. The average indoor temperature during winter, around 5 degrees Celsius. That's 41 degrees Fahrenheit inside. So you huddle, you shiver, you survive. Clothes become your second skin, and sometimes your third and fourth. Undressing isn't an option. You sleep in what you wore all day, and you wear it until it nearly walks off on its own. Washing clothes in winter is a luxury. Water freezes, soap is rare, and cold, wet wool is worse than filth. People become creative. Straw-stuffed mattresses insulate just enough to take the edge off. Cloaks are used as blankets. Children sleep beneath fur pelts handed down for generations. If you have a dog, it doesn't sleep by the door. It sleeps with you. And if you're lucky, it's a big one. It's a poor, which was most everyone adapted by necessity. There were no choices, only habits. Life was cold. Life was hard. And the nights were always longer than they should have been. But the peasant had something else. Something modern life has mostly forgotten. They had rhythm. The natural world governed everything. The sun told you when to rise. The cold told you when to rest. The seasons weren't background noise. They were law. And winter was judge, jury, and executioner. Still, they made it. Somehow, every time you curl up under a warm blanket and press a button for heat. Remember this, in 1325, someone like you was going to sleep in a freezing hut with snow blowing through the cracks and nothing but firelight and breath to keep them alive. And they made it. Now, let's look at how. The first thing you learn when you're cold is this. Your body is a furnace. Clumsy, inefficient one, perhaps, but it's the only one you've got. And in the Middle Ages, it was often the difference between life and not waking up. When the fire died down and the wind howled through the slits in the walls, cute, turned to the only heat source more reliable than embers, each other. A bed wasn't just a bed. It was a group project in the modern world. Sleep is a private ritual, a soft mattress, a blanket or two, maybe a partner, maybe not. You might even complain if your dog takes up too much space. But in a 14th century peasant hut, privacy didn't exist, and solitude could be a death sentence. If you slept alone in January, it was probably because you were sick, or you'd already frozen to death. So instead, people piled in, parents, children, grandparents, even distant cousins, if they were passing through. It wasn't just common, it was expected. Sometimes entire families, 6, 8, even 10 members, all squeezed into one sleeping space. It's no embarrassment, it's no awkwardness, no concept of personal space. You'd press up against the body next to you, elbows and ribs, knees tangled, noses touching, not because it was comfortable, because it was warm. Not just people. Animals slept indoors too. In peasant homes, animals were often invited to the sleepover, whether you wanted them or not. Livestock were incredibly valuable, not just for milk, meat, or wool, but for survival. In many rural villages, animals like pigs, goats, and even cows were brought inside at night. Not into a separate barn, not into a distant shed, but into the very same room where people slept. It served two purposes. First, security. Keeping your animals inside meant they were less likely to be stolen, eaten by wolves, or simply wander off into the blizzard and vanish. Second, and maybe more importantly, animals generate body heat. A single cow can radiate more warmth than a small fire. A cluster of pigs under a bench could mean the difference between a tolerable night and frostbite. The result? You'd often sleep with your family on one side of the hearth and your livestock on the other. Sometimes the smells were unbearable, but the cold didn't care about your nose. It cared about your bones. It's children in the middle, elders at the edges. Even in this crowded configuration, there was a method to the madness. In colder months, children were usually placed in the center of the sleeping group, cocooned between adults. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster, and their immune systems were weaker. Parents instinctively huddled around them like human shields against a freezing night. Elders, on the other hand, often took the outer spots, had more experience, and sometimes more layers. But they also faced the greatest risk. In harsh winters, stories spread of old men and women who simply didn't wake up. Death came quietly on the outer edge of the bed pile when the fire was low and the cold slipped in unnoticed. There were no thermometers, no carbon monoxide alarms, okay? No down jackets. Survival was strategy, okay? And the arrangement of sleeping bodies became a kind of geometry. One part necessity, one part love. Sleep wasn't straight through. Here's something strange. Medieval people didn't sleep like we do. They didn't crawl into bed at 11 p.m. and wake up at 7. That tidy 8-hour block. It's modern, a result of electric lighting and fixed schedules. Back then, sleep came in two parts. First sleep and second sleep. They'd go to bed not long after sunset, say 7 or 8 p.m., and sleep for a few hours. Then, around midnight, they'd naturally wake up. They might tend the fire, pray, tell stories, even visit neighbors. Then, after an hour or two, they'd return to sleep for the second half, until sunrise stirred them awake. This pattern wasn't a quirk. It was documented across Europe, in diaries, sermons, even medical texts. People spoke casually of the hours between first and second sleep, using the time for everything from contemplation to more adult activities. Yes, even with livestock in the room. And in the dead of winter, this segmented sleep was a blessing. It gave them a chance to check on the fire, to rebank the embers, to warm frozen limbs, or simply to confirm that everyone, human and animal, was still breathing. Hate comes from within, and between modern heating is impersonal. You press a button and warm air arrives like magic. You might not even notice it working, but in medieval times, heat was intimate. It was touch, breath, shared blankets, shared sweat. It came with smells and snoring and the occasional accidental elbow to the face. It was human, had a saying, whispered by mothers to their children, to keep warmer than one, and 3 warmer than 2. The body was a tool, a furnace, a gift. It gave heat when the fire couldn't. It gave life when the night tried to take it away, okay? And perhaps, in some quiet, instinctual way, it gave love, too, because when you're pressed up against someone in the dark, okay, and the wind is screaming outside, and the frost is creeping along the walls, you forget for a moment how hard the world is. You remember you're not alone. They slept in what they wore, and wore what they slept in. There was no changing for bed. Pajamas weren't a thing. The idea of slipping into something comfortable, that was reserved for the noble classes, people with wardrobes. Peasants had maybe 1 or 2 outfits, both made of thick, scratchy wool. If you were lucky, you owned a cloak or a heavier tunic. But even that was shared, passed down, patched, repaired again and again. At bedtime, you didn't strip down, you bundled up. You wrapped yourself in every layer you had, shawls, cloaks, spare scraps of cloth. Some even kept bundles of straw nearby, stuffing it under their clothes to trap heat. And all of it, every rag, every thread, carried the smell of smoke, sweat, and hard labor. But they weren't trying to impress anyone. They were trying to stay alive. Wool wasn't a choice. It was a lifeline. Let's talk about wool. Coarse, itchy, heavy. But in medieval Europe, wool was gold, at least when it came to winter survival. Unlike cotton or linen, wool retained heat even when damp. That made it perfect for peasants who didn't have the luxury of dry, clean clothes during the rainy, sleety slog of winter. Woolen tunics, hoods, mittens, and socks were everywhere. Some families owned homemade blankets woven from sheep's wool, passed down for generations. The more tightly woven the fibers, the better it trapped air and warmth. No one cared about fashion, okay? They cared about not dying, the sound of sleep, and survival. And so, night after night, year after year, the same scene repeated. A A cramped, smoky room, a floor of dirt and straw, a fire fighting its slow death, bodies tangled like roots, wool and skin, fur and hair, soft breathing, occasional coughs, the shifting weight of a pig selling near the hearth. Outside, the wind sighed, silence, and survival. They didn't need white noise machines. They had the crackle of embers, the shuffle of livestock, the sighs of dreams. The Middle Ages were brutal, cold, unforgiving, but in the dark, together, they found warmth. At first glance, a medieval peasant home might seem charming, like something lifted from a fantasy movie. Low ceilings, timber beams, thatched roofs, smoke curling from the center, cozy fire flickering inside. But look closer, and the illusion fades. These weren't storybook cottages. They were drafty, damp, and dangerously cold, and yet the people inside them managed to survive, not with luxury or technology, but with stubborn design, ancient tradition, and the quiet, constant war of adaptation. A house made of mud, wood, and dung. Let's start with what these homes were actually made of. Peasant homes, or crofts, as they were sometimes called, varied by region, but most shared a few essential traits. They were cheap, local, and fast to build. Walls were often constructed from wattle and daub, a crisscross framework of woven wooden sticks smothered in a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. It wasn't elegant, okay? But it was surprisingly insulating. Once it dried and cracked and dried again. Still, over time, wind and rain would wear it down. The walls became brittle, gaps formed, cold air whistled in, so families often patched them with whatever they had, more dung, wet clay, or even moss pulled from the woods. It didn't stop the cold entirely, but it slowed it down. The floors, bare earth, most often. Some packed it with clay or ash for stability, but it was always cold, always hard. And in winter, it turned to stone beneath your feet. Timber frames and low ceilings if you were lucky enough to live near a forest. Your home might have a timber frame, thick wooden beams supporting the roof and structure. These gave the building some sturdiness, but they weren't airtight, not even close. To trap warmth, ceilings were built low, not because peasants were shorter, but because it minimized empty space, less room to heat, less air to lose. Some homes had lofts or sleeping platforms suspended above the main floor. Heat rises, after all, and in winter, a few extra feet off the ground could mean a noticeable temperature change. Children often slept up there, not because it was safe, but because it was warmer. The roof that leaked cold, thatched, and problematic now. Let's talk about the roof. Thatched roofs made from layers of straw, reeds, or heather were lightweight and cheap, and when properly maintained, they actually provided decent insulation. But thatch was also high maintenance. Without constant repair, it degraded quickly. Birds nested in it, mice chewed it, rainwater leaked through, and in winter, snow collected in thick, heavy mounds, slowly melting into cold drips that wormed their way inside. More than one peasant woke in the middle of the night to a splash of icy water from the ceiling, or the soft rustle of a rat finding its way into the straw. No chimney, no ventilation, just smoke. One of the strangest facts about medieval peasant homes, they had no chimney. Instead, smoke from the central hearth rose into the air, pooled along the ceiling beams, and drifted out through holes in the roof or the gable ends. Some homes had small vents, but most just let the smoke linger. This wasn't by accident. In a twisted way, the smoke actually helped. It killed bugs, dried the thatch, preserved food hung in the rafters, and perhaps most importantly, it slightly warmed the air. But it came at a cost. People lived in constant, choking smoke. Their eyes burned, their lungs coughed. Soot coated the walls and the ceiling beams. Children grew up with persistent respiratory issues, but the choice was simple: smoke or freezing to death. There's a reason medieval art often depicts indoor scenes in a foggy haze. It wasn't style, it was survival. Rooms without rooms, one house, one space. Forget bedrooms, forget kitchens. A peasant house was usually one open room, maybe divided by a hanging cloth or wooden screen, if you had the means. Everything happened in the same space: cooking, eating, working, sleeping. In winter, this was actually an advantage. Fewer rooms meant less space to heat, fewer walls to insulate, and more bodies gathered around the fire. Families cooked stews on hanging pots, using iron tripods or suspended chains. The fire never truly died. Even at night, they banked the embers with ash to keep them warm and alive. And when it was time to sleep, they bedded down right there on the floor, near the hearth, beside the goats, the byre dwelling. You and your pig under one roof in some parts of Europe, particularly in colder regions like Scandinavia, Scotland, and rural Germany. Peasants lived in byre dwellings, homes that literally housed people on one side and animals on the other. One half of the house was reserved for the family, the other half for livestock. There was a central dividing wall, often no taller than your waist. The animals weren't just kept nearby, they were part of the ecosystem of warmth. Their bodies radiated heat. Their manure generated warmth as it decomposed. Of course, it also generated smell, a lot of it. But in January, with ice on the doorframe and snow inside your boots, the smell of a warm pig was better than the kiss of winter air. Windows, sort of, but not really. You might wonder, what about windows? Well, not the kind you're thinking of. Glass was a luxury. Even nobility only had tiny panes, and they were thick, distorted, and expensive. Peasants, no glass, just wooden shutters, or cloth soaked in tallow and wax to keep out the breeze. Some had oiled parchment, semi-translucent, letting in a pale blur of light during the day. But at night, these windows let in more cold than comfort. Most were kept covered, sealed tightly, and layered with cloth or wool in winter. Some villagers even blocked their windows completely with straw or dung for the coldest months, preferring darkness over drapes, drapes, hangings, and wall rugs to combat the chill from stone or daub walls. Families used fabric hangings, sometimes old clothes, sometimes animal skins, and occasionally dyed wool if they had any. These makeshift tapestries weren't for decoration. They were insulation, hung along walls, over doorways, or around sleeping spaces. They created pockets of warmth. Some beds were built with wooden frames and heavy curtains, turning them into miniature heated rooms within the house. The warmth stayed trapped. The cold stayed out. Mostly, repair was constant and essential every season. The house demanded something. Cracked daub, rotted thatch, frozen beams, loose stones. A winter storm could peel back your roof like paper, so peasants became constant handymen. They mixed new daub with manure. They climbed onto roofs with bundles of straw. They filled gaps with moss, wool, and anything else that wouldn't blow away. Some even built inner walls during the winter, small wooden partitions added to create sleeping cubbies that could trap heat. A house wasn't a finished thing. It was a living, suffering structure. And in winter, it needed love to stay standing. Light was rare, and precious candles were expensive. Oil lamps were rare. Most peasants relied on firelight alone. In winter, the sun disappeared early, and darkness took over. The hearth became the center of all activity, glowing softly, casting long shadows on the soot-stained walls. Families huddled together in its light, told stories, shared meals, worked with their hands. That tiny circle of warmth and light was the universe, and beyond it, the cold and blackness. The cold was a guest that never left, even with all these efforts. Low ceilings, shared beds, livestock roommates, fire maintenance, wall drapes. The cold still won. It crept in anyway, through the cracks, beneath the door, down from the thatch. You could never stop it completely, only slow it down, delay its grip. Give yourself one more night, and the strangest thing, they adapted. The cold became normal, expected, part of life. And when the sun finally returned in spring, it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like permission to breathe again. In a world without heat, without windows, without comfort, peasant homes survived. They weren't warm, but they weren't warm enough. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Fires that never truly went out, the sacred hearth. In our modern world, a fire is optional, decorative, a flickering glow for ambience or the rare blackout. But in a medieval peasant's home, the fire, the hearth, was everything, its life itself. Without it, there was no light, no warmth, no food, no protection. The fire was the center of the home, the soul of the family. And above all, it was sacred, something between a tool and a god. Because if the fire went out in winter, you didn't just lose heat, you lost your first line of defense against the darkness. And in the cold silence that followed, death crept in, quiet, slow, and without remorse. The hearth was the heart. Literally and symbolically, medieval peasant homes weren't built around bedrooms or kitchens. They were built around the hearth, a simple fire pit in the center of the floor, surrounded by stones or bricks, sometimes raised, sometimes dug down into the earth. Above it, smoke drifted up toward a blackened ceiling beam, collecting in the shadows, looking for a way out. There was no chimney, remember? Only holes in the roof or eaves to vent the smoke. The air inside was thick, always thick, but the fire below, it glowed like a heartbeat. It was where meals were cooked, where clothes were dried, where children listened to stories, where tools were repaired, and most importantly, where families gathered, not for comfort, but for survival. The closer you sat, the warmer you were, but getting too close meant sparks, burns, or clothing catching fire. It was a delicate dance, a daily risk, but no one dared live without it. Banking the fire, an ancient survival trick. Peasants didn't have lighters, matches, or even reliable flint tools. Lighting a fire from scratch took time, skill, and dry tinder, something painfully rare in wet winters. So, instead of starting fresh every day, families relied on a method called banking the fire. At night, just before bed, someone, usually the oldest woman in the house, would carefully rake the hot embers into a pile and cover them with ashes. Not too much, just enough to smother the flames while trapping the heat. This layer of ash insulated the coals, keeping them alive, but hidden like coiled snakes under snow. By morning, the ashes were brushed away. Done right, the embers beneath still glowed, waiting. A few fresh twigs, a puff of breath, and the fire came back to life. It was a delicate process. It's a little ash, and the fire burned out. Too much, and it suffocated completely. But when it worked, it was a quiet miracle. The fire never truly slept. Even while the family slept, the fire kept vigil. Its light flickered on the walls. Its heat chased back the frost. Its crackle whispered in the dark, a lullaby of safety, however faint. And when someone stirred, for water, for the call of nature, for the crying child, they would check the hearth first. Was it still alive? If not, the household woke in panic, stirring embers, adding straw, breathing life into dying coals. Losing the fire meant losing the center. A house with no fire in January was no house at all, was a tomb with furniture, fire, folklore, and female guardianship in many rural communities. Women were the keepers of the flame. They lit it, fed it, guarded it, passed down knowledge of herbs, oils, woods, and burning times. For them, the fire wasn't just a chore. It was a kind of witchcraft, a science handed down without books. Certain types of wood were believed to burn cleaner. certain combinations produced stronger coals. Birch bark was favored for kindling. Ash trees were sacred in some regions. Alder was cursed in others. Superstitions ran deep. Some believed that whistling near a fire invited evil spirits. Others placed iron objects beside the hearth to ward off fairies. A pot of milk left overnight kept the house spirits calm. Forget to leave it, and your fire might go out by morning, taken by the unseen. Whether true or not, one thing was clear. Fire wasn't just heat, it was heritage. Its fuel was scarce, and everything burned. Keeping the fire alive wasn't easy. Wood had to be gathered constantly, often days ahead, and always dried. Wet wood smoked, hissed, and wasted precious heat. But in winter, dry wood was hard to find, so peasants burned everything. Old shoes, broken tools, bits of rope, animal bones, dried manure, even peat. Chunks of decomposed plant matter cut from marshlands, dried and stacked like firewood. It smelled strange, but burned hot. In desperate times, furniture was fuel: a bench, a cradle, a stool that had survived 3 generations, all sacrificed to keep the fire going through one more brutal night. The idea of a cozy fireplace is modern. For peasants, it was a constant worry, a daily race against ash and frost. Night fire, the last task before sleep, as twilight deepened and families prepared for bed. One last ritual remained: tending the fire. Someone, often the mother, sometimes the eldest daughter, made sure the embers were glowing strong. Wood was arranged just right. Coals tucked beneath ash, stones turned. Some even placed iron cauldrons filled with water beside the fire to warm slowly overnight. In the morning, the water was lukewarm, just enough to wash a face, soak a rag, or feed the animals without ice. No one dared sleep until the fire was banked. It was as vital as locking the door, as necessary as breathing. When the room went dark, when the last cough faded, the fire glowed orange behind its blanket of ash. The family slept, knowing that something ancient, quiet, and powerful washed over them. The fire and the dead in some regions. Fires weren't just for the living. When a family member passed away, especially during winter, the hearth fire was kept burning around the clock for days to guide their spirit, to protect the home, and to ward off the cold emptiness that followed death. Ashes from the deceased were sometimes placed in the hearth for a final night, returned to the flame that had warmed them their whole lives. Fire wasn't a tool. It was a spiritual tether. It marked birth, life, and death. It was baptism and cremation in one glowing center of the home. Warmth for the hands, the heart, and the hope. Despite the danger, the struggle, and the smoke, there was comfort in the hearth. It was where babies were born, where couples whispered in the dark, where stories were passed down, songs were sung, and secrets shared. It was the family's anchor. Even as the wind screamed outside and snow crept beneath the door, and the world turned to ice, the hearth was steady, ancient, eternal, and even when everything else felt cold and cruel and empty, the fire remained. Fur and layer upon layer, clothing and survival in the Middle Ages. Your clothes weren't just garments, they were your armor against the cold. You didn't wear them to express personality, you wore them to survive the wind, the frost, and the nights that seemed to have no end. For the medieval peasant, what you wore was what you lived in, slept in, worked in, and often died in. Clothes were never just clothes. They were shields, they were blankets, were all that stood between a human body and a brutal world. Clothes were rare and never really taken off. Let us start with the most sobering fact. Most peasants only owned 1 or 2 full outfits. There were no closets, no laundry cycles. If you were lucky, you had a wool tunic and maybe a second for layering or feast days. But for the most part, you wore the same thing every single day. And at night, you didn't change into sleepwear. kept everything on. In the dead of winter, that might include a woolen undertunic, a heavier outer tunic or gown, cloaks or mantles pinned with bone or wooden clasps, wool leggings or wrappings, a hood or coif to cover your head, and layers of crude socks stuffed into leather shoes. You slept in these. You worked in these. The layers weren't just functional. They were essential, because without them, the cold got in. And once it got in, it didn't let go. Wool, the king of all fibers. Wool wasn't fashionable. It was foundational. Sheep were everywhere in medieval Europe, and their fleece was the most accessible, renewable material peasants had. Wool was insulating, durable, and most importantly, it retained heat even when wet. This single fact made wool more valuable than gold in winter, when the air was thick with fog, the earth soaked with sleet, and the rivers freezing over. A woolen cloak could mean the difference between a cold day and a slow death. But wool wasn't soft. It was coarse, scratchy, and difficult to clean. Washing it required boiling water, beating it with sticks, and days of drying. So, most people didn't bother. Instead, they wore it grimy, smoky, and stiff. Height, sweat, and rain. But again, warmth was the only priority. Not comfort, not aesthetics, just warmth. Fur, the peasants' hidden treasure fur, contrary to popular belief, wasn't just for nobles. While peasants couldn't afford the luxurious furs of ermine or sable like the aristocracy, they hunted or traded for a smaller, local game. Rabbits, squirrels, voles, sometimes foxes or badgers, though this was less common. The fur wasn't displayed outside. That would mark you for theft or scorn. Instead, it was worn inward against the skin for insulation. A rabbit-lined tunic or a squirrel-skin vest might not look like much, but in January, it could keep your heart beating just a little longer. Some families passed down fur garments like heirlooms, not because they were beautiful, but because they had saved lives. Layering, not a fashion statement. A lifeline layering sounds modern, the kind of advice you'd get in a winter-style guide. But medieval peasants were masters of it out of necessity. They layered not for looks, but because each additional piece of cloth trapped a pocket of warm air. Even a scrap of wool, tied around a limb or stuffed inside a shoe, could make a difference. Children were wrapped like little onions. Rag sleeves were tied around knees and elbows. Strips of linen were bound across chests. Old cloaks were cut into scarves. Socks were layered. And if you didn't have enough, you made your own out of straw and wool scraps, jammed tightly into shoes. By modern standards, it looked ridiculous. But when the wind howled and your breath frosted in front of your mouth, you didn't care how you looked. You cared whether you'd wake up. Footwear was. Tragic nowhere was the cold more cruel than at the feet. Medieval peasant shoes were usually made of leather, soft, untreated, and prone to tearing. They offered little in the way of insulation and even less protection from moisture. In wet months, they became soggy sponges. In snow, they turned to stiff boards of ice. Some peasants stuffed straw or rags into their shoes to block wind. Others wrapped their feet entirely in cloth, then slipped them into leather bindings. A few lucky souls wore wooden pattens, elevated soles strapped beneath the foot, designed to keep you above the mud. But for many, winter simply meant cold feet, cracked skin, and the slow march toward frostbite. Cloaks, hoods, and makeshift marvels, the outermost layer was always a cloak, often made of heavy wool, fastened at the neck with a wooden pin, a piece of bone, or a braided cord. It was your blanket, your coat, your pillow. If you were lucky, it reached the floor. Not, it was patched so many times it resembled a stitched-together flag. Over the head, peasants wore hoods or coifs, tight linen caps or woolen hoods that framed the face and held in precious body heat. Some were attached to capes, others were worn separately. But no one went outside in winter without one. That would have been as foolish as walking out naked. Hands were often wrapped in spare cloth. True mittens were rare, and gloves even rarer. But anything to trap heat was used, even bundles of grass tied around the wrist. Necessity bred creativity. Washing was rare and risky. Here's a grim but important truth. In winter, most peasants didn't bathe. They couldn't. There was no hot water. Rivers were frozen, and removing your clothes to scrub in icy air was a fast way to get sick or dead. So the layer stayed on for weeks, sometimes months. Decay accumulated. Smells intensified. Lice and fleas became winter roommates, but people found small ways to cope. They scrubbed exposed skin with rags dipped in warm water, heated near the hearth. They used ashes as a crude soap, rubbing it into the scalp or underarms. Some chewed herbs to cut the odor. Still, hygiene was sacrificed for survival, because the moment you stripped down to clean up, the cold could kill you. Clothes were repaired endlessly, and then again every tunic, cloak, and sock was repaired again and again. Needles were precious. Thread was often made from plant fibers, animal sinew, or unraveling old cloth. Women, and sometimes men, spent their winter evenings by the hearth, darning holes, patching tears, and strengthening seams. A shirt didn't die after one season. It faded into usefulness down the generations, first worn by the father, then by the son, then cut into rags, then used to patch a boot, then burned his kindling. Even the scraps were sacred, slept in your layers, all of them. At bedtime, you didn't peel anything off. You piled more on. Peasants slept in everything they owned, wrapped in cloaks, furs, and straw-stuffed sacks. Some even wore ropes tied around the waist to hold layers close. Children slept inside woolen sacks or shared cloaks with siblings. In the harshest months, some families took turns sleeping near the hearth, rotating in shifts so everyone had a chance to warm their frozen bones. It wasn't about comfort. It was about not freezing to death. The cold was inescapable, but you adapted. No amount of clothing could completely shield a medieval peasant from winter. Fingers went numb, faces cracked, breaths turned ragged. But the human body is stubborn. It adapts. It adjusts. Okay? In time, peasants learned to feel warmth where none existed. A faint breeze became a blessing. A night without wind was a miracle. The fire's embers, a sunrise in the dark, and their clothes, stitched from wool, patched with love, lined with rabbit fur, tied with straw and prayer, became not just garments, but lifelines, a second skin against a merciless world. When the cold one, death, illness, and winter burials for the medieval peasant. Winter wasn't just a season. It was a predator. It crept in silently, wrapped in mist and frost. It slipped through the thatch, seeped under doors, crawled into the bones. You didn't fight winter. You endured it, and sometimes you didn't win. Because for all the fires banked, cloaks minted, and bodies huddled together, sometimes the cold got through. And when it did, it didn't just bring shivers. It brought sickness, suffering, and death. Sickness was a winter constant, even before the cold claimed lives outright. It weakened the body, left it vulnerable. Frostbitten fingers turned black, lungs filled with wet, rattling coughs. Joints stiffened, skin split open and festered. There was no warmth to dry you. No clean clothes to change into. No modern medicine to stop infection. In the cold months, peasants fell to lung sickness, winter fevers, and a general condition they simply called the wasting. Adea, wasting, had no clear cause. A slow weakening, loss of appetite, hollow eyes, cold limbs, and eventually silence. Today, we might call it hypothermia. Back then, it was just the cold winning. The elderly were the first to go. Age was a dangerous thing in the Middle Ages, especially in winter. Elderly peasants already weakened by decades of labor and poor nutrition, were often the first to fade. Even if they shared warmth with the family, their circulation was slower. Their reserves thinner, sleep deeper, too deep sometimes to wake from. There are stories passed down in folk memory of old grandfathers who simply didn't wake up one morning, or grandmothers who curled by the hearth, eyes closed, and never opened them again. Sometimes families didn't even notice at first. A still body was common in a cold home. Only when the morning came and the fire was stoked did someone realize one person wasn't breathing. And just like that, another life, quietly reclaimed by winter. Infants and children were always at risk if old age was dangerous. Youth was no better. Infants and toddlers had the weakest defenses against the cold. Their small bodies lost heat quickly. They couldn't regulate temperature. They couldn't cry loud enough when wrapped tightly in winter layers. Many mothers slept with their babies pressed against their chest, skin to skin, under wool cloaks, hoping their own warmth would be enough. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it wasn't. There were no incubators, no doctors to call, no warm baths to bring a child back from the edge. A quiet baby in the morning wasn't always a blessing. Sometimes it was a tragedy wrapped in wool. Starvation wore a winter cloak the cold didn't kill alone. It brought hunger with it, like a shadow. As winter dragged on, food supplies dwindled. Grains turned moldy. Vegetables rotted. Livestock were slaughtered early to avoid feeding them. And once the salted meat was gone, there was nothing but scraps. Some villages resorted to bark broth, boiling tree bark in water for a hint of nutrients. Others dug up frozen roots. Some, in desperation, boiled leather scraps, shoes, belts, even book bindings, to chew on something, anything. The cold made food harder to prepare. Firewood was rationed, and without proper meals, bodies wasted faster. You didn't need to freeze solid to die in winter. You just needed to grow too weak to sit up. It's frostbite, gangrene, and rot when limbs froze. They didn't always thaw. Peasants working in the fields, gathering wood, or tending animals often lost fingers, toes, and entire feet to frostbite. They had no thermal gloves, no boots with insulation. It's cloth, leather, and hope. Frostbite wasn't the end, though. Infection followed. In blackened flesh, in weeping sores, in the awful smell that warned families long before a priest arrived. Sometimes the afflicted died quietly. Sometimes a limb was hacked off, crudely, with a fire-heated blade. The success rate, low. The pain, unimaginable. The cold didn't just take lives, it mutilated them. It's death at night, discovery by dawn. The most common time to die in winter. At night, you'd go to sleep, under furs, near the hearth, wrapped in your only cloak, and simply stop. Your breath slowed, your heart slowed. The cold seeped in deeper than before. And when morning came, you didn't. In homes where entire families slept, side by side, dead weren't always discovered right away. A still body felt no different than a sleeping one. It was only when someone tried to rouse them and failed that whispers began. He's cold. He won't wake. Fetch the priest. There was no panic, just a slow, dreadful acceptance. The cold had claimed another. Winter burials were brutal. What do you do with the dead when the ground is frozen solid? That was the question every village faced by December. Graves were impossible to dig by hand. The earth was stoned beneath frost, so instead, families kept the dead in storage. That's right, temporary crypts, shallow frost pits, even inside barns or storage cellars. Bodies were wrapped in cloth, often the same garments they had died in. There were no coffins for peasants, just earth when it finally softened. Until then, they waited. Come early spring, the village gathered, sometimes to bury an entire winter's worth of dead in one day. The priest spoke once. The names were read. 10. The frozen were finally laid to rest. Light for the dead, fire for the living. In some places, a candle or small flame was kept burning beside the body until burial, not for light, tat, but to keep evil spirits away. Superstition said that winter deaths invited hungry ghosts, spirits of the cold who wandered the snow looking for warmth, for breath, for something living to cling to. So a flame burned as a warning, as a ward, and even as the body froze, the fire remained. The quiet kindness of death in winter, as grim as it sounds. Many medieval peasants didn't fear winter death. Prepared for it, saw it as part of the cycle. They left notes scratched in wood, passed on tools, whispered last words into the dark. There was no drama, no weeping, only acceptance. Sometimes death meant release from hunger, from pain, from the ache in your joints and the smoke in your lungs and the cold that never quite left your spine. It was sad, but never shocking. And for the living, it was motivation to keep the fire burning, to mend the cloak, to check the child's breath one more time, because winter always wanted one more soul, and you had to make sure it wasn't yours. Community and cold. How villagers helped each other survive in the deep freeze of medieval winter. Isolation was a death sentence. Lone family could survive a few weeks, maybe, but without help, without neighbors, without someone to lean on when the fire died, when the food ran out, when the child fell sick. You didn't stand a chance. And so, long before the concept of community was a buzzword, peasants understood one brutal, sacred truth. You survive the winter together, or not at all. Villages were built for survival, not beauty. Medieval villages weren't planned for aesthetics. They weren't quaint, charming hamlets with picket fences and pretty gardens. They were built close and clustered, often with houses pressed against one another, narrow alleys, shared walls, communal spaces. Why? Because closeness meant warmth. Closeness meant access. If a neighbor's fire went out, you didn't have to hike miles through snow, just cross the lane. If wolves came, you didn't face them alone. You had 20 sets of eyes. Even the animals, sheep, goats, pigs, were often kept in communal sheds or barns, sometimes shared between 3 or 4 families. Everyone contributed. Everyone depended on each other. It wasn't kindness, it was survival engineering. The communal fire, a lifeline in every village. Many villages had a central fire, often located in the main square or near the church. It burned low but steady, day and night, watched over by an elder or a group of appointed keepers. When a family's hearth went cold, or a child's fever drained their wood supply, they could come here, carry embers back, warm their hands, cook a meal. This fire belonged to no one and everyone. In winter, it wasn't just a source of heat. It was a symbol of shared endurance. It meant we are still alive. We are still together. And as long as that fire burned, hope did too. Sharing food wasn't charity. It was math. If your neighbor starved, you weren't just down one person. You were down a farmhand come spring, a hunter, a weaver, a watcher of children. So when the family's bread ran out, the others shared. A little grain here, a dried turnip there, a hunk of old cheese. Not out of compassion, though that played a part, but out of practicality. In medieval villages, hunger was contagious. If one family slipped into famine, the others followed. So people learned, better everyone eats a little than some eat none. Even the poorest households kept a tiny stockpile hidden, not for themselves, but for the widow down the lane, the blind man, the orphaned child. Because someday it might be your door they knock on. The sound of community, listening in the silence. Winters were quiet, so quiet. No buzzing machines, no distant traffic, just the wind, the occasional cough, the bark of a hungry dog. In this stillness, Villagers listened. They noticed a house with no smoke for 2 days. Someone went to check. A baby that hadn't cried in a while. Someone knocked. A man who hadn't been seen at morning prayers. Someone asked questions. This wasn't gossip. It was life-saving vigilance. Every sound, or lack of it, was a clue. Every pause, a potential danger. In modern times, silence is peaceful. In the medieval world, it was suspicious. The mutual watch, eyes in the frost villagers, developed unspoken systems of protection. One elder stayed up late, listening for wolves. Another watched the hills for bandits. Children were taught which neighbor to run to if something went wrong. If your husband didn't return from chopping wood, a search party went out. No delay. If your firewood pile was too low, someone slipped you a few logs. These weren't favors. They were investments in mutual survival. Every life saved was a life that might save yours tomorrow. It's shared shelter. When one roof wasn't enough, if a roof collapsed, or a storm shattered a home, or illness left a family too weak to keep the fire burning, they moved in with others. Families doubled up, tripled up, slept in piles like animals. No one turned them away, because next month you might be the one knocking. Even in the most overcrowded huts, space was found. Children shared bedding. Elders gave up the warmest spot. Strangers became kin. Surviving winter meant forgetting boundaries, forgetting pride. You opened your door, or you invited death in with your silence. It's the firewood brotherhood. Gathering firewood in the coldest months was dangerous work. It's frostbite, injuries, wolves, the simple exhaustion of dragging logs through snow. So villagers often worked in pairs or trios, chopping together, hauling together, guarding each other. If a man fell ill, his neighbors chopped to share. Someone's axe broke, another lent theirs. Because no fire meant no life. Silent pact to keep each other's fires alive was as sacred as marriage. It wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. You chopped for your neighbor because you were chopping for yourself. Women's circles, sewing stories, and strategy. Winter gave women a unique power, the power of the hearth. While men gathered wood and hunted, women made the warmth real. They cooked, they mended, they whispered strategies. Small groups of women gathered in the warmest house, bringing their mending and their children. While hands worked wool and fingers sewed patches, ears exchanged vital information. Marta's child hasn't eaten in 2 days. Old Henrik's fire keeps going out. The wolves are closer this year. These weren't gossip circles. They were command centers, coordinated responses disguised as casual visits. In the wool cloaks and baby wrappings sewn in these circles, they often saved more lives than any sword. Church and charity. When faith meant firewood, even the poorest churches tried to help in winter. They opened their doors for warmth, lit extra candles, allowed peasants to sleep inside when homes collapsed or hunger hit too hard. Monks distributed thin soups, dried loaves, or spoiled wine, anything that could keep a villager going another day. And while charity wasn't always consistent and clergy could be cruel or corrupt, the idea of mercy in winter was sacred. It wasn't about God. It was about not letting someone freeze to death beside the altar. Oral wills and deathbed promises in winter. Death loomed. So villagers shared their final wishes aloud. Not written. Few could write, but spoken to neighbors, to family, to friends. If I don't wake, give my cloak to Jorah. That iron pot is for Greta. She needs it. Tell my son I forgave him. These weren't legal documents. They were acts of trust. And when the person died, the village remembered. Cloaks were passed. Words were delivered. Tools were shared. In the cold, memory was a form of justice. It made grief warm, even for a moment. Trauma passed down. And the stories that saved when spring finally came, and the thaw melted the snow from graves. The village breathed again, but the trauma stayed. Children remembered the sound of coughing, the silence of a neighbor's door, the tightness of hunger, okay, the cold that crawled inside your bones and whispered, this might be the end. And so they told stories of winters survived, of fires that refused to die, of neighbors who knocked just in time. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were instructions. They taught the next generation how to lay a wall, how to bank a fire, how to tell when someone was slipping away. The past became protection, okay? And that's how communities survived the cold, not by strength or wealth or luck, but by never facing it alone. It's forbidden warmth, strange superstitions, and bizarre cold remedies. In a world without thermometers, doctors, or science as we know it, medieval peasants didn't just survive the cold with fire and furs. They survived it with superstition. Because when you're wrapped in smoke-stained wool, your children are coughing in their sleep, and frost is creeping through the rafters. Logic alone won't save you, but maybe, just maybe, a charm might, or a spell, a bundle of herbs, a chant whispered to the fire when no one was watching. You didn't have to believe in it, just had to not take the risk. It's cold as a curse. Too many medieval peasants. Winter wasn't just weather. It was a living thing, a force that hated warmth, that punished the careless, the impure, or the unlucky. If you got too cold, too fast, they didn't blame nature. They blamed witches, spirits, old sins, believed the cold was sent as punishment, a divine reminder of human weakness. Others feared that jealous neighbors could wish you cold with the wrong glance, the wrong word. Superstitions sprang up like frost on the windows. Never whistle near the hearth. They might call the spirits of cold. Don't light 3 fires in one day. The third brings death. If the fire crackled too loud at night, someone was lying under your roof. Whether true or not, people listened, because superstition in winter was insurance. Herbal brews and fireplace potions, no medicine, no problem. You brewed your own, from whatever you had. Few common cold remedies used by peasants. Boiled nettle tea, thought to heat the blood. Onion skin water, for lung coughs. Bear fat and ash, rubbed on feet. Then wrapped in linen, meant to ward off frostbite. Rotten apple cores, placed under the pillow to draw out fever. Clove and garlic mash, burned in the fire to smoke out spirits. Some peasants placed bundles of dried herbs over the hearth, believing the warmth released protective vapors. Others added herbs to the firewood itself, releasing strange, sweet smells, and hopefully repelling sickness. Did they work? Unclear. But doing something always felt better than doing nothing. Strange objects by the fire peasants often placed odd things near the hearth, and not just to dry. Iron keys or horseshoes to ward off evil. Bones of birds, especially owls or crows, to trick death into skipping the house. A single coin buried in the ash to trap hunger. And on certain nights, especially the longest nights of the year, it was common to whisper your fears into the fire, then throw in a pinch of salt. The crackle was said to mean your words had been heard, and if the fire hissed back, doubt was a warning. Dreaming by firelight sleep was dangerous in winter. You never knew who would wake, so dreams took on meaning. People believed the fire could send visions or protect against them. Peasants left out silver buttons for good dreams, straw crosses for protection, dead moths to absorb bad spirits. Dreams of burning hair meant illness was coming. Dreams of silent snow meant death. Dreams where the fire went out, you were next. To prevent nightmares, mothers told children to sleep facing the fire, so the warmth could guard their soul. Whether it worked didn't matter. It helped them sleep. The hearth, which every village had one, she wasn't called a witch aloud. A coup, get you all burned. Goo. But every village had a woman, usually old, usually quiet, who knew things. She knew which mushrooms cured fever, which bark too steep for sleep, which twigs burned cleanest. and which one screamed when lit. She helped with births, with coughs, with quiet burials, okay? And she always sat close to the fire, 'cause she understood that the hearth wasn't just for warmth. It was a portal, a keeper of secrets, a giver and taker of life. If your child was sick, you went to her. If your fire wouldn't light, you asked her to bless it. If your dreams were bad, she'd give you a charm to hang above the hearth. Some feared her, but no one ignored her. Firewood, superstitions. Even the type of wood you burned mattered. Ashwood, the safest, burned clean without spitting. Favorite for babies and elders. Elder, cursed. Burning it, risked calling spirits. Willow, burned, quiet, too quiet, said to absorb heat. Yew, never burn you indoors. The smoke was poisoned, but some believed it told the future. Peasants memorized these rules like prayers. They taught their children not just how to start a fire, but what kind of fire to start. Strange ways to warm the blood. Some peasants believed cold lived inside you, that it could nest in your belly or spine, hiding until it struck. So they tried to flush it out, sipping hot wine with herbs, even when there was barely wine to spare. Wrapping stones in cloth, heating them by the fire, then placing them under their clothes, hanging garlic from their belts, not just for warmth, but to keep away the winter whispers. Drinking animal blood, fresh, believing it restored fire to the body. Desperate, yes, strange, extremely, but in a world with no help coming. Even the bizarre became tradition. The fire itself was alive above all else. The hearth was not just fire, it was a being. A quiet, glowing presence that demanded respect. You never cursed in front of it. You never pointed your feet toward it while sleeping. Disrespectful, you fed it scraps from your meal, especially the first bite. A gift, you thanked it aloud before leaving the room at night, just in case. Children were taught that if you angered the fire, it wouldn't just go out, it would turn on you. Your house would smoke. Your luck would sour, and warmth, once lost, would not return. Better to whisper a blessing than risk a vengeful flame. When faith and fear intertwined in some homes, the Bible sat right next to the bundle of dried sage. A crucifix on one wall, and a bag of bones tied near the ceiling beam. Peasants were deeply religious, but they weren't fools. They knew the church didn't always have answers, so they turned to both God and ghosts for help. They prayed before sleep, and hung an owl feather in the rafters. They confessed on Sunday, then buried a clove of garlic in the garden to keep spring sickness away. This wasn't contradiction. This was survival. And when the cold came howling, you didn't care which power answered your call, only that someone did. Superstition as a second blanket. Did any of it work? That didn't matter. Superstition was a way to hold on to hope. To believe you weren't completely helpless. That some part of this endless, bitter cold could be reasoned with. And when the fire burned low, and your fingers ached, and the walls creaked like bones, it helped to believe that your child's dream had meaning. That your neighbor's cough could be cured with the rosemary and ash. That the little stone you buried beneath the hearth last week was doing something. Superstition wasn't weakness. It was a shield of belief. A story you wrapped around yourself when the wind got too loud. Sleeping in shifts, midnight tasks, and the hours no one talks about. You'd think that once the fire was stoked and the cloaks pulled tight, medieval peasants could finally rest, drift off into the kind of deep, uninterrupted sleep that only comes after a hard day's labor. But in winter, nobody really slept through the night. Not completely, because the cold didn't rest. The livestock didn't rest. The fire didn't tend itself. And neither did fear. So peasants slept in shifts, rose in silence, and wandered the dark hours performing small, sacred tasks. Not because they wanted to, but because if they didn't, someone might not wake up in the morning. First sleep, second sleep. The split night most people today sleep in one long stretch. But in the medieval world, Sleep came in two parts. First sleep, a few hours after dusk, when exhaustion dragged you down. A quiet, wakeful period in the middle of the night. Then, second sleep, deeper, calmer, usually ending at dawn. During that wakeful gap, often around midnight to 2 a.m., peasants rose quietly, moved about the house, stirred the fire, whispered prayers, checked on children even, reflected. It wasn't strange. It was normal. Some sat and watched the flames. Others mended clothes. Some even visited neighbors for hushed conversations, exchanging dried herbs or news from the next village over. In the dark stillness between sleeps, the world felt softer, more alive, and somehow more dangerous. The firekeeper's duty every night. Someone was chosen to stay half awake. A mother, an elder, an older child, to monitor the hearth. The fire had to be banked properly, with ash laid carefully over glowing coals so it would smolder, not die. But sometimes it needed to be revived. That meant crawling from warm bedding, uncovering the coals, feeding dry kindling into the orange glow, blowing gently until flame reappeared, all without waking the others. It was a thankless task, done by habit, done by instinct, 'cause if the fire went out completely, there might not be enough warmth to relight it before the frost took hold. Tending the animals at midnight, the animals didn't sleep through the night either. Pigs grew restless. Goats cried out. Chickens huddled together in nervous silence. In the dead of night, someone had to check on the livestock's warmth, break the ice crust on water troughs, scatter hay listen for wolves. It was cold work, often done in silence, lantern in hand, the crunch of snow underfoot, the only sound. Some peasants whispered to the animals as they worked, not because they expected replies, but because no one else was awake. These moments were lonely, quiet, sacred, mending, making, and midnight labor when your day was filled with labor. Hauling wood, feeding animals, chopping ice. You did the quiet work at night. That meant repairing torn cloaks, darning socks, sharpening knives, braiding rope or twine, weaving straw mats, scrubbing pots, all done in near silence beside a dying fire, while children snored and frost crept up the walls. It wasn't busy work, survival work, the kind you couldn't afford to skip, not even for sleep. And while your hands worked, your mind wandered. Back to old memories, forward to spring, or just focused on staying awake long enough to finish one more stitch. Rotating sleep in the warm spot hierarchy beds were rare, mattresses rarer. So families slept on pallets, piles of straw, sometimes wrapped in cloaks or sharing one blanket between them. But the warmest spot, closest to the fire, was in tea for the head of the house. It rotated. One night, a child, next, an elder, then someone recovering from illness, then someone whose boots were still wet. This was an unspoken system. No arguments, no greed, because everyone knew if you hogged the warmth every night, someone else might freeze, and guilt burned colder than the wind. Candle watch, and the fear of the dark, even in villages where firewood was scarce. One candle was often kept lit through the night, not for light, for protection. Darkness was full of rats, lice, thieves, ghosts, nightmares. Some believed that leaving the fire unattended invited spirits, that shadows grew longer when no flame was watching. So someone kept candle watch, half asleep, eyes barely open, whispering prayers under their breath. They weren't guarding the house. They were guarding the boundary between the living and whatever waited in the cold. The witching hour, whispers, warnings, and unseen eyes. There was 1 hour, just before second sleep, that everyone feared. Roughly between 2 and 3 a.m., the death hour, the howling hour, the time when fires smoked without reason and the wind called names through the cracks. Peasants told stories of dreams that woke the dead, windows that opened themselves, children whispering in their sleep to people who weren't there. Some claimed to hear footsteps on the roof. Others swore They saw figures by the fire that vanished when approached. No one admitted to believing these tales, but no one sang, joked, or made noise during that hour either. And some quietly made the sign of the cross before going back to sleep. Midnight meals, the hunger that came late. Peasants rarely had dinner before bed. Food was scarce, firewood limited. So, during the wakeful gap between first and second sleep, many shared a small midnight meal. A crust of bread, if there was any of boiled root, left in the coals, a sip of sour ale, or warm goat's milk. It wasn't for nutrition. It was symbolic, a reminder that you've made it halfway through the night. A ritual of survival, a toast to still being alive. Silent conversations in the night. Some of the most honest conversations happened during this midwinter wakefulness. Whispers between spouses, fathers talking softly to sons, elders recounting stories they would never share in daylight. Because night stripped away pride. The dark was a confession booth, a place where you could say, "I'm scared, the food won't last. I dreamed of the old village again. I don't think I'll make it to spring." And no one judged you, because everyone had thought the same things. Listening for the wolves, finally, one of the most important midnight tasks. Listening. The wind, the animals, the snow. But above all, wolves. They moved closer in winter. They knew when humans were weakest. And if they came close, you'd hear it. A dog whimpering, the goats stamping, the distant, awful harmony of a howl if it came too close. Someone would have to rise, quietly gather stones, check the fence, and sometimes sit by the door with a blade across their lap. Not to fight, just to watch, 'cause if you saw them first, you had a chance. Spring comes slowly, the end of winter and the rituals of survival. Spring didn't arrive in the Middle Ages with blooming flowers and cheerful birdsong. Came like a prisoner limping out of the dark, 1 inch at a time. First, the frost cracked, not melted, just cracked. Then came the mud, thick, wet, and full of rot. Then came the rains, endless, bitter, and cold. And finally, after all of that, the grain. But the peasants didn't rejoice right away. They didn't dance or sing, because spring was suspicious. It might be here to stay, or it might turn around and leave you for dead. The first sign, birth among beasts before the flowers, before the warmth. The animals knew. Goats gave birth. Sheep bellowed in labor. Chickens clucked with fevered energy. Tiny hooves and downy feathers meant one thing. Something had shifted. Peasants watched the livestock carefully. If the lambs were strong, spring was coming for real. If the birds failed or came too early, winter would strike once more. Sometimes, whole villages would pause their work just to watch a single goat give birth, because that moment, slimy and chaotic and sacred, meant the tide might finally be turning. The earth gives. Slowly, the ground was stubborn, frozen deep into the bones. It took weeks to thaw enough for anything useful. Even then, the first crops weren't planted. The land had to be tested, poked with sticks, dug up in corners, smelled, tasted, crumbled between fingers. A skilled peasant could tell if spring had truly arrived by the smell of wet soil. If it was sour, more frost was coming. If it was earthy, warm, rich, could finally begin to hope. The rains that drowned joy. The snow left silently. The rain replaced it violently. Spring rains in medieval Europe were cruel. They flooded fields, collapsed thatch roofs, turned footpaths into traps. Houses that survived frost sank into the mud. Still, the rains were welcome in a grim, teeth-gritted sort of way, because water meant life. And peasants, huddled under cloaks in flooded cottages, whispered the same bitter phrase every year: better wet than frozen. The last of the winter stock spring came before food. That was the great cruelty. By the time the first sprouts appeared, most families were down to scraps. Moldy grains, sour ale, maybe a few dried beans. Children were thinner. Mothers had sunken cheeks. The old ones, if they'd made it this far, they were ghosts already. So, spring began with rationing. Half portions for the adults, the softest bits for the children, a communal stew pot shared among households. This was the time of waiting for green. It would come, slowly, stubbornly, but it would come. Burying the dead of winter with the thaw came the final task. All those who had died and had been kept cold in barns, sheds, or beneath frozen mounds could now be laid to rest. Entire villages gathered for mass burials. Priests muttered short prayers. Families said nothing. The grief had passed weeks ago. Only relief remained. They were finally in the ground. Finally free of the cold. It was a quiet morning, not for the dead, but for the ones who were still here. Fire becomes optional, but not forgotten by now. The fire had been burning for over 100 days without pause. It had been fed in the dark, guarded during storms, whispered to during illness, and now it didn't need to burn so bright. But no one let it die. Even on warmer days, the fire was kept going, as a symbol, a reminder of what it took, of what it had cost, of who didn't make it. Fires were no longer for heat. They were for memory. It's the first outdoor chores leaving the house. Truly leaving it was emotional. For months, you'd been trapped by snow, by fear, by cold. Now, with boots half sinking into mud, you stepped outside. Tasks returned slowly. Thatched roofs needed fixing, tools had to be resharpened. Fences were re-raised. Fields were cleared of debris and bones. That's right, bones. Because sometimes things died outside during winter, unnoticed in the snow. A goat, a wolf, even, in rare cases, a man. And the thaw revealed it all. Footpaths reappear, and so do neighbors in spring. The world became bigger. Paths between cottages reformed. Villages that had gone silent for months began to trade, to barter, to breathe again. You saw faces you hadn't seen since October. Some thinner, some quieter, some missing children ran barefoot. Dogs barked again. Laughter, cautious at first, returned to the air. And still, no one celebrated yet. They all knew. A single frost could undo it all. The rituals of thanks and guilt. Even the most religious peasants made offerings to the earth when spring finally stuck. Bits of bread left under trees, coins buried at the edge of the field, ashes from the hearth mixed with seed grain for luck. Some even whispered apologies to the frost for surviving. Survivor's guilt wasn't new. It was ancient, and it made spring bittersweet. You had made it, but at a cost. The first green bites, eventually, the green one. Young nettles, wild garlic, fresh watercress, dandelion leaves, small, bitter, and wonderful. Peasants ate these raw, sometimes crying from the joy of chewing something that hadn't been salted, dried, or frozen. The body responded. The coughs eased. Strength returned. The winter was finally over. Not because the calendar said so, but because you could taste it. The fire becomes smoke, then memory eventually. The fire was allowed to die. Not completely. It would always be relit. But for a brief moment, the hearth could go cold. A full night's sleep returned. Children played instead of clinging to cloaks, and families stopped watching the wind with suspicion. Still, some would visit the hearth just before bed, out of habit. They'd laid their hand on the stone, whisper a thank you. Remember the faces that hadn't made it, 'cause the fire had been more than warmth. It had been the heart of survival. And life began again. The medieval spring wasn't a party. It was a resurrection. Not loud, not glorious, but sacred. A baby born without freezing. A loaf baked with fresh flour. A single, unbroken night of rest. These were the victories. The peasants didn't need parades. They just needed one more season, one more meal, one more day. They had it. The coldest winter on record. How it nearly wiped Europe out. Imagine this. You've barely survived another medieval winter. Spring arrives, and it rains, and rains, and rains. Not for a day, not for a week, but for months. The fields flood. The grain rots, the roads vanish under mud, and the animals, they start to die. Then the people do. This isn't a story. This happened. It's from 1315 to 1317. Europe suffered the Great Famine, the coldest, wettest, deadliest extended winter period in medieval memory. It was the kind of season that didn't just starve the poor, it shattered civilization. It started with rain. The spring of 1315 should have been a relief. Instead, the skies opened with a fury no one had seen before. It rained for weeks on end, washing away seeds, drowning sprouts, and flattening entire fields of barley, oats, and wheat. Even when it stopped raining, the land couldn't recover. The sun never came. The sky stayed gray, the ground stayed soaked, and the crops, they never grew. By midsummer, people knew this harvest was gone. But worse, so was the next. A food chain collapse. No crops meant no feed for animals. Pigs starved. Cows stopped producing milk. Chickens fell silent in their coops. Horses, the engines of medieval labor, collapsed in the fields. Peasants began eating seed grain, the last desperate move before true collapse. That grain was meant for the next season's planting. By fall, it was gone. They had eaten the future. Its prayers and punishments, churches overflowed with weeping peasants. They begged God for sons, confessed sins they hadn't committed, whipped themselves in public. Still, the rain continued. The cold deepened. Skies grew darker. Priests declared it was the judgment of heaven. Witches were blamed. So were lepers, Jews, foreigners, anyone different? But no scapegoat made the skies clear. No sacrifice warmed the soil. Hunger turns to horror as the winter of 1315 set in. The famine escalated into something worse. Real starvation. Children dropped in the streets. Parents bartered everything for a crust of bread. Families abandoned their elderly to die in barns. Not out of cruelty, but calculation. And in whispers, in dark corners, in places no priest would dare visit. People spoke of the unthinkable. Cannibalism. The story of the baker's son. In one town, unnamed in official records, a baker was accused of slaughtering travelers for meat, baking it into pies, and selling it to desperate locals. The authorities investigated. They found bones, not animal bones. The baker was executed, publicly, but long after, villagers claimed to smell meat pies in the air when no one was cooking. The ghost of hunger, they said, had taken residence there, a reminder of what a cold, endless winter can do to a man's soul. Underground storage. Emptied. Even the wealthiest man in a village, with full root cellars and well-stocked pantries, ran dry by the second year. Why? Because grain can't survive flooding. Mold crept into barrels. Rats grew bold. Preserved meat spoiled when water leaked in. What was meant to last 3 winters barely made it through 1. And still, the rain came. And still the people waited for spring like prisoners, counting days until release. Starving the strong one of the cruelest truths of the 1315 to 1317 famine. It killed the healthiest first young men, working mothers, strong-bodied teens. Why? Because they burned more calories. They needed more food. And when food ran low, their bodies collapsed faster. The weak, the elderly, they starved too, of course. But the horror of this famine was that it emptied the middle, the future, the labor, the muscle that ran every farm and forged every tool. Gone. Death becomes normal. Gravediggers couldn't keep up. In many towns, bodies were stacked in churches or left at crossroads. In rural villages, entire families were found huddled together in death, wrapped in the same cloaks they had once warmed each other with. By the end of 1316, it's estimated that 10% to 15% of the European population had died. That's millions. And still, the famine continued. Fragile spring, minus 1,317 by the start of 1317. The rain slowed, slightly. Fields dried. Not completely, but enough to plant again. Seeds were scarce, but villagers shared what they had left, and somehow, miraculously, something grew. Small, wheat crops, a thin harvest, but enough. The Great Famine didn't end with a feast. It ended with a single loaf of bread, split 12 ways, shared in silence, and remembered forever. What changed afterward? Shockingly little. There were no grand reforms, no public outcry, no new agricultural revolutions. But there were changes, buried in the quiet. Villages planted diversified crops. People stored food in multiple places. Not just one root cellar. Folk tales spread of the time the sky betrayed us, and every cold season after. Peasants waited with haunted eyes because they had learned something terrible. Winter could last 2 years. And when it did, it didn't just kill crops. It reshaped history. Why the 1315 to 1317 famine still matters. It's easy to forget. In our world of supermarkets and central heating, what weather used to mean, one season, one storm, one flood, could be the end of everything. The famine of 1315 wasn't just a tragedy. It was a reminder that civilization is fragile, that hunger can come without warning, and that the cold doesn't care who you are. All it takes is a few months of rain for the world to forget how to feed itself. Centuries later, we still whisper about it, the forgotten tricks, medieval hacks that actually worked to stay warm. In a time without electricity, insulation, or modern heating, staying warm in the Middle Ages wasn't just a comfort, it was survival. And while many relied on superstition or brute endurance, some peasants figured out workable hacks, practical, repeatable strategies that helped people make it through brutal winters. These weren't miracles. They weren't magic. They were trial and error tricks, passed down like recipes and refined over generations. And many of them still work today. 1. Wool on bare skin. Modern folks wear layers. Medieval peasants did too. But they understood one key rule better than we do. Wool must touch the skin. Why? Because wool traps heat even when wet, and wearing it directly on bare skin created a heat seal. Your body warmth stayed close, and cold air struggled to get in. They didn't layer cotton under it. No synthetic liners. Just itchy, raw wool tunics. Scratchy, but life-saving. 2. Double breeching for wind defense. Men often wore 2 sets of breeches in winter. The outer pair was slightly looser and oiled to resist wind and snow, while the inner pair hugged the skin. Was a medieval version of layering with insulation and a windbreaker, and it worked surprisingly well. Women, too, wore multiple underskirts, creating warm air pockets that trapped body heat while still allowing mobility. 3. Brick bed warmers before bedtime. Peasants would heat flat stones or bricks in the fireplace. Once warm, these stones were wrapped in cloth and slipped into beds beneath the straw. They radiated heat for hours, especially if tucked under the blankets near the feet or lower back. Some wrapped the stones in animal hide for a longer lasting effect. This trick was so effective, it inspired the later invention of the Victorian bed warmer, just with a little more class and less soot. 4. Sleeping close. Strategic cuddle geometry. Sleeping with others wasn't just about comfort. It was geometry-based insulation. Peasants used specific formations in bed. A child between 2 adults. Elders on the outside. Infants pressed against chest or belly for constant warmth. Some families even alternated head and foot directions, allowing bodies to nestle into each other more tightly, minimizing heat loss. They weren't just cuddling, they were forming a human furnace. 5. Straw, hay, and the surprise of dry leaves. Beds weren't fluffy mattresses, they were sacks filled with whatever was available. Straw, hay, even dry leaves, because these materials trap air, which acts as an insulator. The trick was keeping them dry. Some even lined bedding sacks with a layer of wool scraps or thin cloth to reduce direct contact with itchy straw. And when it started to smell, they flipped the mattress, then burned it in spring. Clay boot inserts. Peasants sometimes use thin clay or terracotta inserts inside their boots, warmed by the fire beforehand. These weren't for cushioning. They were primitive heat pads. Once warmed, the clay held heat for a surprisingly long time. Farmers would slide them into wool-wrapped boots and trudge into the frost with something close to toasty toes. 7. Controlled drafting, letting the cold in on purpose. Most cottages had gaps in the roof, the door, the walls, but peasants learned to control airflow rather than block it entirely. They left a small upper window or gap slightly open, especially at night, to allow smoke and moisture to escape. Why? Because a room that's too sealed fills with dampness. Damp makes cold worse. By controlling ventilation, they could prevent smoke, suffocation, and reduce the chilling effects of condensation. It wasn't elegant, but it was clever. 8. Onion layer dressing. The phrase, dress in layers, isn't new. Medieval folks knew how to build layers smartly. Undergarment-based tunic, overtunic, or surcoat, cloak. Every layer had a job. Wick, sweat, trap heat, block wind, shed snow. Even better, these layers could be removed or adjusted depending on the task, so the body never got too sweaty. 9. Eating to stay warm. Peasants learned early that cold bodies burn more energy, so they ate small, hot meals throughout the day. Thin stews, broth with herbs, fermented cabbage, or even just warm water with a few oats. One favorite, bone broth, simmered for hours over the fire. It delivered calories, warmth, and electrolytes, and it was basically free, just bones and patience. Some families even drank ale warmed with spices, believing it stirred the blood. They weren't wrong. 10. Help animals didn't just live outside. In winter, many peasants brought livestock indoors, not into the main room, but into side rooms, attached stables, or even underfloor pens. Why? Because animals generate a ton of heat. A sleeping pig under your floor was worth 10 blankets. A cow in the next room radiated enough warmth to take the edge off the chill. It was loud, it was smelly, but it was warm. 11. Room within a room. The winter chamber. Wealthier peasants or extended families sometimes built inner rooms, small, low-ceilinged spaces inside the main hall. These winter chambers were easier to heat, easier to seal, often located on the second floor, where rising heat accumulated in some homes. Everyone moved into the winter chamber after the harvest and didn't return to the full house until spring. It was like hibernating, but in a tiny hot box filled with 5 relatives and a goat. 12. Greased cloth as wind barriers. No glass, no problem. Peasants stretched linen cloth across windows and soaked it in animal fat or wax. The result? A translucent, flexible sheet that blocked wind and rain while letting in a faint glow of daylight. It wasn't pretty. It didn't last long, but for a few precious weeks in December. It meant the difference between shivering and surviving. 13. Head first. Why hoods mattered most. Modern people underestimate how much heat escapes from the head. Medieval peasants didn't. Nearly every outfit included a hood or coif, fitted head coverings made of wool or thick linen. Even indoors, people kept their heads covered, sometimes with layered hoods, especially while sleeping. It wasn't a fashion statement. It was life or death insulation. 14. The hearth coin heat insurance. In some regions, peasants placed a coin or iron trinket near the hearth at the start of winter. Not just superstition, though that played a part, but because the coin would darken with soot and heat exposure. The coin stayed shiny. It meant your fire was dying too fast, or not getting hot enough. A medieval thermometer. No, but a clever hack. Absolutely. 15. Sleeping twice. Remember first sleep and second sleep. Peasants didn't just accept the wakeful gap. They used it strategically. They'd wake, stoke the fire, warm up stones, drink something hot, or even change layers before the coldest hour of the night hit. Instead of fighting the break in sleep, they built their survival routine around it. Why these hacks worked? Because they weren't guesses. These tricks were refined over hundreds of winters, based on observation, passed down by word of mouth, and tested in the coldest conditions imaginable. They weren't always perfect, but they helped peasants survive. Not just for one season, but for generations. And that's something even the best insulated house can't replace. The truth about peasant homes, why they weren't just dirt and misery. Picture medieval peasant house, and you probably imagine this: a sagging roof, mud walls, a dirt floor, maybe a goat sleeping in the corner. And sure, some of that's true, but the full story, it's way more interesting and a lot more clever, 'cause medieval peasants weren't stupid. They lived close to the edge, yes, okay, but they built homes designed to keep them alive, using materials, knowledge, and hacks that were passed down for centuries. Their houses weren't just shelter. They were weapons against the cold. Timber, wattle, and daub. The forgotten engineering, the basic peasant home, wasn't random. It was a combination of timber frames, local wood, often reused wattle, forming the wall's daub, slapped onto the wattle. It sounds crude. It was incredibly efficient. When dried properly, daub insulated well, keeping warmth inside and wind out. And wattle was surprisingly flexible, meaning the walls bent instead of cracked during storms or frost shifts. Okay. These weren't stone fortresses, okay, but they worked. And they could be built in under a month with community help. The roof, where the real work happened, roofs were vital, and they weren't just plopped on top. Thatched roofing was water-resistant, insulating, repairable with simple tools. Thicker thatch meant better insulation, and some wealthier peasants had roofs up to 3 feet deep in packed reed. Bonus, animals sometimes nested in the upper layers, and if they didn't become pests, they actually helped generate extra heat near the roof. Gross, yes, but effective. Also yes, the hearth. More than just a fire pit. In nearly every peasant house, the central hearth was life itself. It wasn't just for cooking. It was a light source, a heat source, a place to dry boots, socks, herbs, ropes, firewood. The emotional heart of the household. Early peasant homes didn't have chimneys. Smoke escaped through the thatch or small vents. It sounds awful, but the smoke had a secret job, preserving the thatch and killing bacteria in the air. Yes, the smoke saved lives. Furniture was sparse, but smart. No one had a couch. Most didn't have a chair, but furniture had function. Chests were used as both storage and seating. Benches lined the walls and doubled as beds. Hooks and rafters hung drying herbs. Meat and laundry loft beds were common in colder areas. The higher you slept, the warmer it was. Everything served more than one purpose. Even the family table, often a board laid across trestles, could be removed or tilted toward the fire to act as a heat reflector. The sleeping arrangement myth. Yes, families often slept in the same room, but that didn't mean no boundaries. Parents slept near the fire. Children were grouped together, sometimes in makeshift crib pits dug slightly into the straw. Elders slept in corner nooks, where walls blocked the draft in wealthier peasant homes. There might be curtains or hangings for privacy, not fancy ones, just coarse linen or woven wool, but they made a difference. Not just for decency, but for warmth. Dealing with drafts, peasant homes were drafty, no question, but people got creative. They hung wet animal hides over doorways to block wind, stuffed old rags, hay, or moss into wall cracks, kept a draft cloak near the door for anyone coming or going, even covered holes with oiled parchment or greased linen to block airflow, but allow in light. It wasn't glamorous, but it was adaptive engineering. dirt floor does not equal dirty living. Most peasant homes had dirt floors, yes, but that didn't mean they were living in filth. The floors were beaten flat, sprinkled with herbs or rushes, regularly swept with birch brooms. Some families even layered straw or woven mats, especially in winter, to reduce cold rising from the earth. And guess what? Wooden floors weren't common until much later. Dirt was standard, even in wealthier homes. Windows without glass, most windows were holes, nothing more. But again, peasants got creative. Covered windows with animal bladders, linen, waxed cloth built shutters to close tight at night. Used slits angled toward the fire, so heat escaped slower and smoke drifted outward. These window hacks cut down on drafts while allowing some airflow. When it snowed, the shutters stayed shut tight, and everyone stayed near the fire. Seasonal modifications. Peasant homes changed with the seasons. In winter, wall hangings went up. Extra straw was packed into cracks, and the central hearth burned almost constantly. In summer, walls were scrubbed, straw replaced, firewood restocked, and thatch was repaired. A home wasn't a static structure. It evolved with the year. It had to. Orientation. The secret of southern facing, where you built your home, mattered. Many medieval cottages were deliberately oriented so the main wall faced south to absorb as much sunlight as possible during the cold months. This meant longer daylight hours, indoors, a slightly warmer wall, better drying conditions for clothes, wood, or children recovering from illness, even without thermometers or blueprints. Peasants understood thermal logic. Beliefs built into the architecture homes weren't just functional, they were spiritual spaces too. Horseshoes were hung near doors for luck. Some homes had charms in the rafters to ward off cold spirits. Thresholds were treated with herbs or blessed salt and ash. From the first winter fire was often saved and sprinkled around the outside of the house in a ritual of protection, because sometimes warmth came from belief just as much as fire. Homes were temporary, but the knowledge wasn't peasant. Homes didn't last forever. They rotted, they leaned, it collapsed, but the knowledge of how to build them, that endured. Children learned from parents. Neighbors helped neighbors. Repairs were communal, and when a house died, a new one was built, usually on the same ground, because survival wasn't about permanence. It was about passing down the right tricks. Final thought, not just huts, but havens. We mocked peasant homes as mud pits and hovels, but the truth, they were smart, adaptive, full of quiet genius. And most importantly, they worked. They kept families alive in the face of impossible cold, endless winters, and the ever-present threat of hunger. So the next time you hear someone say, medieval peasants lived in filth, remind them, filth doesn't keep you alive through January, but function does. Peasant myths that aren't true, and the ones that absolutely are. The word peasant comes with a suitcase full of assumptions. Dirty, dumb, starving, helpless, covered in mud, and praying for potatoes. But as we've seen, the real story is way more complex and often surprising. Let's bust the biggest myths about medieval peasants, and, just as importantly, confirm the brutal truths behind the ones that are real. It's myth number 1. Peasants were always starving. Not exactly. Yes, winters were brutal, famines happened, and survival wasn't guaranteed. But in normal years, most peasants ate enough. Their diets were simple but filling. Bread, porridge, beans, and peas, cabbage, and root vegetables. Occasional meat. It wasn't luxurious, but they weren't eating rats for breakfast either. Real starvation was rare, but always looming. True, when food ran out, it got dark fast. Famine wasn't constant, but when it hit, it wasn't just hunger. It was death, disease, madness. People abandoned their children, boiled shoe leather, or worse, and the line between okay and disaster, one bad harvest. Myth number 2. Peasants never bathed. Totally false. In fact, many peasants bathed regularly, especially in summer months when rivers and streams made it easy. Even in winter, they used heated water in wooden tubs, cloth rinse and steam from the hearth. Herbal rinses. Lack of soap. Sure, lack of hygiene. Not necessarily. Many were cleaner than people in later centuries. True, they smelled like smoke, earth, and animals. Just because they bathed didn't mean they smelled like roses. Most peasants carried the scent of wood smoke, wet, wool, dirt, livestock. It wasn't foul. It was just real. And to them, it was the smell of home. Myth number 3. They were all uneducated. Wrong again. K. Peasants weren't scholars, but many could count, track lunar cycles, read religious symbols, memorize laws and oral traditions, understand complex farming methods. Some villages had schooling priests or monastic influence, and many children were taught basic literacy, especially for church life. Did they read Latin? 2. Could they survive using applied intelligence? Absolutely. It's true. Books were for the rich. Owning a book was like owning a Tesla today. Rare, expensive, mostly for show. Peasants passed knowledge orally, by stories, folk songs, and rituals. It worked, and it stuck. Myth number 4. They lived completely isolated lives. Not true. While rural, most peasants were part of tight-knit communities that shared labor tools, celebrations, food in hard times. They also traveled more than you'd think, to markets, festivals, pilgrimages, or even other villages for work. Yes, their world was small, but it wasn't lonely. It's true. Some never left a 10-mile radius. Many peasants were bound to the land under feudal laws, meaning they couldn't leave without permission. While some traveled for fairs or work, others spent their entire lives within walking distance of their home. Freedom wasn't a right. It was a privilege. Myth number 5. They had no culture or joy. Wrong. Peasant life wasn't just toil and gloom. They had music, dances, feasts, and games, folktales and local legends, seasonal rituals for planting, harvesting, and marriage. They even had jokes, dirty ones, mostly, because even when death was next door, people still laughed. True. Life was short, and they knew it. The average peasant rarely lived past 45, and infant mortality was shockingly high. They didn't take time for granted. They married young, worked young, took risks, celebrated hard, because tomorrow was never promised. Myth number 6. They were passive and obedient. Some were, but others were rebels. They protested taxes, staged local uprisings, defied lords, hid grain, smuggled salt, ran illegal stills, practiced forbidden rites. In 1381, English peasants led a full-blown rebellion, storming London with pitchforks and fury. They weren't sheep. They were wolves in rags when they had to be. True. Speaking now could get you killed. Medieval justice was swift and cruel. Rebels were hanged, burned, drawn, and quartered, publicly humiliated. So while rebellion happened, it came at a price. Myth number 7. They were emotionally cold. Total nonsense. Medieval peasants were deeply emotional. They grieved hard, prayed passionately, celebrated wildly, told love stories, sang lullabies, wept at births and deaths. They carved symbols into cradles for protection. They wore tokens of dead family. They buried children with hand-sewn dolls. Love didn't need luxury. It needed firelight and memory. It's true. Grief was everywhere when death comes every winter. You carry sorrow like a shadow, and peasants didn't hide it. They honored the dead, prayed aloud, left food for spirits. It wasn't weakness, it was resilience through grief. Myth number 8. Peasant women were powerless. Not quite. Women worked, earned, managed, and survived. They ran households, brewed beer, midwifed births, managed harvests, spun wool, fought off bandits, bartered in markets, sang songs that passed down entire bloodlines. They had fewer rights, yes, but no one ran a village without its women. True, they had few legal protections. A woman's rights belonged to her father or her husband. Widows had some independence, But most women were expected to obey, and punishment for defiance could be severe. Still, many bent the rules and made lives on their own terms. Final truth: peasants were never just one thing: poor, often, tough, always, dumb, never, hopeless, not even close. They were inventive, emotional, gritty, and loyal, living at the edge of human endurance, but never surrendering to it. They carried Europe on their backs and did it without a single thank you. But maybe now we can finally give them one. Final reflections: what we can learn from the peasants who endured. Close your eyes for a second. Imagine you're standing in a frost-covered field, your breath rising in clouds, your hands are calloused, your feet wrapped in worn wool, and the horizon is coated in silence. No machines, no lights, no electricity humming behind the walls. Just you, the land, and the cold. This was life, not for a few unlucky souls, but for the vast majority of humans for more than 1,000 years. And somehow, they survived it. They had nothing, and yet, everything. No thermostats, no space heaters, no thermal jackets, no running water. And yet, they endured storms, hunger, war, plague, and famine with nothing but firewool, family, ingenuity, and pure, stubborn human will. They didn't survive winter by outsmarting it. They survived by adapting to it, one layer at a time, one ember at a time, one night at a time. What carried them through? It wasn't strength. It wasn't faith alone. It wasn't magic. It was something quieter, something older, something we still carry in our bones. The instinct to care for others, because warmth shared is warmth doubled. The urge to keep trying, even when the sky won't clear. The rituals of rhythm: eat, gather, mend, rest. The memory of firelight on the wall, and the way it makes even a shack feel like a fortress. This isn't history. It's our inheritance. It's lessons we forgot and need again. We live in a world that fears boredom. We scroll, click, tap, skip. We want faster food, warmer homes, more entertainment. But peasants knew how to sit in the silence. They listened to the wind. They watched their children sleep instead of Netflix. They didn't do nothing. They just did what mattered. Repairing a cloak, stirring a pot, singing old songs, whispering stories to remind their children who they were. And in that quiet rhythm, they found something modern life struggles to give: presence. Why their story still matters: because we forget how fragile comfort really is. One blackout, one winter storm, one lost job, and suddenly we realize how much we've outsourced our survival to apps, machines, systems built by others. The medieval peasant didn't have a backup plan. They were the plan. That's not just admirable. That's worth remembering. This wasn't just a sleep story. Yes, maybe you clicked this video to unwind, to drift off, to slow your mind. But beneath the whispers of firelight and wool cloaks, something deeper lingers. This wasn't just history. It was a glimpse into a way of living we've lost, and maybe, in small ways, should find again. Appreciate simplicity. Build things that last. Sleep close. Cook slow. Listen to the wind. Share warmth freely. And never, ever forget those who endured the long nights before us. One last thought before you sleep. If you're warm right now, if you have food, a roof, a bed, you've already beaten the worst winter any peasant ever faced. They would have called your life a paradise. And yet, they didn't complain. They endured. They adapted. They taught us how to live in hard times, even if we forgot. So, as you close your eyes, remember, every blanket you pull over yourself, every warm meal you enjoy, every quiet night you survive without fear, was built on the backs of people who had none of that, but gave us everything, not with gold, but with grit.